community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real conversation with Dr. Anita. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, and I am the founder and CEO of Dr. Anita Enterprises. As a C-suite trusted advisor, I help leaders and teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. And today I am thrilled to have on my Real Conversations from the C-Suite guest, Ms. Deepa Purushothaman. She is the co-founder of Information Company and author of the book, The First, the Few, and the Only. Deepa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to first start by asking you to interpret one of my favorite quotes from Andy Stanley, and it goes like this. Leadership is all about taking people on a journey. The challenge is that most of the time, we're asking people to follow us to places we ourselves have never been. How would you interpret that?
I think that's so true, right? I think leadership is asking people to maybe step into spaces where they are not comfortable. And part of the challenge that we have in this day and age is that a lot of our leaders look the same. They come from a similar background. They've been raised in the same way. They come from, similar parts of the country. And part of what we're missing as a result of that sameness is an appreciation for the fact that, one, many of us lead differently, and that leadership can look different. So I think that quotation is really important in this moment, because if you haven't walked in other people's shoes, if you don't have that awareness, there is a model that's happening, especially in a lot of workplaces, where we make leaders look the same, so that the funnel as you go higher and higher looks the same. And as a result, I think a lot of us opt out. I think a lot of us get left behind. And when I say us, I mean people who are not necessarily the white male leaders that have come before. And so it's a moment to really ask ourselves, what kind of leadership are we promoting, and is there space for new leadership?
Mm-hmm. Now, psychologically speaking, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that what we see as different is automatically seen as a threat. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, in my book, I talk about this a little bit, and it's not my work. There's a lot of academic research on this, especially around Black women. And I think this is maybe what you're talking, pet to threat. And this idea that early in the research is based in Black women, but it actually, I think I found enough of my own anecdotal research that I would say it applies to a lot of women of color. Early in people's careers, that they are seen as a pet. They're seen as cute, or their ambition, especially Black women, is seen as, oh, they're motivated. That's great. We'll reward them. But as these women go up and up in their career, they're actually seen as a threat. And any sort of request around ambition or more is seen as, why are they asking for too much? Why don't they know their place? And I found that to be a real story, or a real challenge, or a real thread through I interviewed 500 women of color in writing the book. And I found that to be a real thread, that a lot of women are supported earlier in their career, but as soon as they get to a point where maybe they're stepping into managing others, or they're stepping into a bigger role, there's a sense of know your place and be grateful for what you're given versus what else can I help you with? And that really feels real.
That reminds me of a scenario that I've heard recounted a lot in my own career, where once we reach a certain level and we decide to progress, we go through the position, we're encouraged to apply, but we don't get it. And then on the flip side, we're asked to train and coach the person who did get it. So what is that phenomenon where I'm not good enough for the position, but I'm good enough to train and coach the person who's going to be over me? Tell me about that.
I think it happens in all different forms. I found, one, that a lot of us don't always feel like we're ready. So that, I think it's more commonly called imposter syndrome. But what I found with the women that I interviewed is a lot of us don't necessarily put our names in the hat thinking that we're not ready, or we don't look, again, like those models that come before us. And then I think it's real when we don't get the position for whatever reason, or we don't get the opportunity for whatever reason. I think there's often this, and it's not in every situation, but I think we need to look at all the extra things women of color, and especially Black women, get asked to do in the workplace. Sometimes that's office housework. Sometimes that's caretaking. Sometimes that's talking about the latest police shooting, like it's talking about current events. But some of the time it's actually sharing your knowledge without realizing that is an extractive process. And that we're not looking at, why the woman who was actually training the person wasn't qualified or wasn't really promoted, right? In the same way as wasn't seen as qualified, I should say, air quotes, when wasn't promoted with the person that was. I think we have to recognize that the research suggests that we tend to hire and promote people that look like us. And again, back to your first question, that the people sitting in the seats default to people who look like them, then people that look like you and I aren't always the ones that get the promotions. And so understanding conscious bias and unconscious bias, both pieces of that, is really important in this work.
So as a former senior partner at a very well-known and respected company, you had taken people on a journey, which just by being who you are as a woman of color in corporate America, you had first taken yourself. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure I answer just kind of my own journey is what you're asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent 21 years at Deloitte, which is a large global company. I was our first Indian American woman partner, and I made partner really early. I made partner in my early 30s. And I, again, being a first, I think there was a lot of, I was good at my job, of course, but there was a lot of eyes on me. And, I did really well in that sort of situation with those eyes on me. And I moved very quickly through the partnership and through my career. And I found later in my career, I started to get sick, the travel, I think a lot of things caught up to me. And I was asking also bigger questions around what I wanted to do with my life and purpose. I spent almost 3 years struggling with wanting to leave. I think that's the more exciting part of the conversation, or the more nuanced part of the conversation. Yes, I rose. Yes, I did well. And we could talk about how and why and how, why that was the case. But for me, the real interesting conundrum was I spent 3 years trying to leave. And I think part of why I really struggle with leaving was because I felt like there were a lot of eyes on me. I felt like my leaving would not only signal my own, potentially failures or challenges, but my signal to other women of color around me and after me that they weren't, the seat wasn't made for them, or they couldn't make it in the seat. And so it took me a lot of conversations to give myself permission to go. And those conversations came through meeting with women, one-on-one, but then a number of group dinners that I shared with you prior to our starting this recording, where I did about 15 dinners across the country where I met 300 senior women of color, so VP level and above. I was just networking for what did I want to do after my job. And what I ended up finding was that we had patterns in the challenges that we went through in these spaces, hence the book, The First, the Few, the Only. There are experiences for many of us because we're the first in our family to go to college or work in the corporate space. We're one of a few in a department or a company, or we're the only, sometimes at a certain level. And as a result, like very strange things start to happen, and strange in the sense that, some of the women I interviewed, I love this quote. One of them would say to me, and the research supports this, a lot of white men will mentor a dozen, mentees. The women I interview will say, like, I, mentor maybe 2 dozen. So let's say 24. Some of the women of color I interview will literally mentor 200, 250, because there's no one else in the company or the industry to do it. And so those are the kinds of examples, or that's kind of what I'm getting at. And so the dinner started to uncover those patterns. And that's really led me to my work now, which is really focusing on women of color and what we do. But it came from my own journey and trying to understand, yes, I rose. Yes, I had a very unique experience. And a lot of my work was about making space for others. But why was it so hard for me to go? And what was that about?
So I want to ask you about that, because we're going to get to your work with your information. I love that. And 3 years, that's a long time. Were you just making sure that you had clarity about where you were going to go next? Were you making sure that you had clarity about why you were leaving? Were you making sure you had clarity about the process of leaving? What was it?
I think it was all those things. You also have to remember I was in a partnership. So I liken it to academia. So I was basically a tenured professor, and I had spent, at that point, I think, I left at 21 years, but I had spent so long, 18 years, right? Like climbing that ladder and getting to that place. And so I think there was a little bit of like, I'm in the seat now. Like, this is everything I've given up, so many years for. Like, what am I doing? Am I making the right choice? I also left during COVID. So there was an early stage of COVID. So I left before we called it the Great Resignation. So there was a lot of, you have to be going to something. And I was not well. And so I almost took 8 months off just to get better and to rest. And so there was a little bit of like, you can't be leaving security at this point, to do that. And I think for me, it was a little bit of reckoning of like, well, who am I at this point? I have spent, majority of my adult life in this company, working a certain way, striving for certain goals. And all of a sudden I found myself not sure that those things mattered to me anymore, and wanting to make different impact in the world. And so it was a real value sort of questioning, I think, for me too. And yet I was transitioning, meaning like I still had some of my old values, and yet I was stepping into this new life and these new values that I started to feel, by the way, that I think a lot of us are feeling as a result of COVID. I just maybe felt them a little bit earlier. And then here I was, not necessarily the person, I've become, and the things that matter to me now were not the same things a couple of years ago. And so it was that process. And I think for a lot of people who exit a high-powered job or a corporate role or something they've sacrificed a lot to do, you're leaving a lot behind. You know, in the book, I call it writing my work obituary. Like I wrote it and rewrote it many times because it was my identity. Like I had sacrificed so much for that role. And so it was hard to leave.
You touched on quite a few things there, the values clarification that we all go through at one point or another, but more particularly when we're switching from one role to another, which brings up the fact that we have to be very, very careful not to confuse who we are with what we do, because when that role is gone, we feel like we no longer exist. At the same time, when we're looking for that optimal, we definitely want to align our who with our do. Making sure that who you are as a person, your goals, your values are in alignment with what it is that you do. And not everyone has the opportunity to pursue their passion as their profession. More often than not, most people need to see their profession as their place of provision. And so it absolutely takes some time to think through that, make sure that we're doing the right things for the right reasons, the right ways for the right outcomes. So clearly you knew of which you spoke when you published an article in Fortune magazine in March of this year entitled "Women of Color Can No Longer Buy into the Inclusion Delusion." Before I read a few passages that particularly resonated with me, what was the catalyst for this article? Was it on the heels of that 3-year process trying to figure out where I'm going next and why?
The article came just as the book had come out, so it was kind of some of the feelings as I was going out on my book tour. One of the original titles for the actual book, The First of You, the Only, was Inclusion Delusion. So it actually, I pulled it from there. And it came from those dinners, actually, to be honest with you, that I described. And so I would get in those rooms with these high power women. And I myself, I think, was feeling depleted at the time, right? I had reached the seat, and yet I wasn't necessarily happy. I was sick. I was confused, right? Here I am with everything that I've strived for, and I'm not happy. Like there's something wrong with me. And I get in these rooms, and over and over and over again, I would see that to be the pattern with all the women too. And so I talk about this in the book. The most really confusing message I heard early on was, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful. And that hit me over and over and over again. I wanted to understand that. And so that's really what became my research and all the things that I do now. I didn't know it would turn into a book at the time. That was not the plan, but it came from that statement. And what I unpacked, or what I found, is a lot of us are, again, back to your first, that's why I love your first quotation, because it's so relevant. I think a lot of us are conforming, are behaving a certain way in order to rise. And because we see leadership as corporate America or as workplaces in a certain way, like you have to be assertive, you have to be aggressive, you have to be competitive, you have to be these qualities that we have defined as a good leader is necessary, which I, by the way, don't think you need to have, but that's what we've been taught. And so most of us get to the seat, and I think it doesn't match our values. It doesn't match how we're made. It doesn't match who we are. It asks us to put aside so much of how we were brought up and, what our community values. And so it's that disconnect. So these women are sitting in seats of power and not feeling powerful. And so that's a little bit of the inclusion delusion. It's this idea that corporate spaces want us, but do they really want us, or are they asking us to play a role? Right? And I talk about that more aggressively in the book, but are they asking us to play a role that's really, in a sense, tokenism, but in a lot of other ways doesn't really make them happy in the end. It doesn't make us happy at all. So that's really
a couple of passages from the Inclusion Delusion article. Professional women of color have always been victims of, and sometimes unconsciously complicit in, the inclusion delusion, the conundrum of being highly visible as the first or only woman of color in their organization, at the same time never feeling like they belong, are respected, or have power. Then you go on to say, companies have stepped up to the plate to hire us, flaunt us in team photos and charity dinners, and offer us up as evidence that they have a diverse workforce. However, they don't pay attention to how challenging it is for us to feel a part of their cultures or what they can do about this. The inclusion delusion fools employers and the women of color who accept their job offers. When we arrive, we think our title and position of power will give us the opportunity to create change. Then the truth sets in. What's being asked of us is to fit into an existing culture, not to evolve it. Wow.
I think that's so true. Like I don't know I need to add any more, but I think what's to me most interesting is in this moment, that is, paraphrased in their own ways, what I hear the most often from chief inclusion officers, right? They're being put in these roles, especially Black women, being put in these roles. They don't have the power they were promised. They don't have the reporting they were promised. They don't even really have the company mandate that, they were told that the company is really interested in doing these things.
And oftentimes they don't have the funding that should go with that to actually get something done.
Or the staff or any of it, right? And so it's just all broken. And so and I'm picking on the highest seat with that role, but I think it's true throughout the organization. So I think that is really a challenge for us. And a lot of my work is about how do we feel powerful and whole? How do we align with our values and still do the work that we were hired to do? And how do we remake the work so that it works for us is really what I'm pushing people to do.
Deepa, this conversation has been so fascinating up to this point. Community, we're going to pause right here and pick up where Deepa and I leave off here when I talked to her about her newly published book entitled The First, the Few, the Only. Please come back because there's so much more to unpack. In the meantime, if you want to hear this particular podcast again or any of my future broadcasts, please go to my website, www.drnita.com. On the landing page at the top in the center, there's the button, Keeping It Real. That's my podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share your feedback. Tell me what it is you want to hear about because I want to present a show that's going to be most beneficial for you. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.